we'd like to talk about our Allagash event and some of the other things surrounding us. It's an extremely complex case, and it is still ongoing. So we'll try to get as much in the allotted time that we have, and hopefully we'll have time afterwards for some questions. I just want to preface our presentation by saying that Charlie and I we're family for many, many years, since 1974. I know he denies it, but it's true. And we've had very, very hard times dealing with this at times. And so we tend to kind of cover up the anxiety with joking around and things like that. So if we say something that we think is funny and offends anyone in the audience, please, we apologize ahead of time. We don't mean to step on anybody's own belief systems or their own experiences. It's just how we deal with it. So if we say something that offends you, we apologize. It's only so we can deal with it. So you want to say something, Charlie, before we get started? All right. Well, we're in the famous state of Maine, and this is where all this happened. So we'd like to get going right, and we'll get started on the Allagash. Charlie, you want to lead in?
Well, good evening. Thanks really for everyone coming and for your interest in this case that actually happened right here in the state of Maine in 1976. Jack, Jim, Chuck, and I had planned a year in advance for a hiking and canoeing trip on the Allagash, and we had started purchasing our gear and preparing for it by climbing the steepest hills we could find in preparation for climbing Mount Katahdin and enjoying the rigors of spending nearly 20 days in the Maine wilderness. So I guess I'll call it the first slide, which is your wonderful state of Maine, and you can see the Allagash running north of Baxter State Park. And we left Boston at early hours in the morning and spent about 11 hours driving from Boston. 4 of us cramped in a tiny little Chevy Vega with a aluminum canoe strapped to the top and all the gear that we were going to be carrying for the time we were in country. You can see a little closer detail of Baxter and the Allagash here. This is a picture of the twins, Jack and Jim and Chuck, standing on Knife's Edge, peering over, and there's one, about ready to pretend he's going to dive off. That would be this fellow seated to my right. Couldn't encourage him. I gave him $20, but he still wouldn't jump. This is what I looked like in 1976, and that's not a toupee, that's my real hair, really. So, we were at the top of Katahdin overlooking this small lake at the basin, and we spent our first day climbing up over the top of the mountain. We came back down that evening and prepared for our trip up the Allagash. After we left Baxter State Park, we drove over to Shin Pond and got on a small bush plane and flew in. This is just a stock picture I grabbed to show anyone who's not familiar with a bush plane what they actually look like and where they have to land. This is the shadow of the plane that we were in as we flew over the mountains, or over the forest, heading into Telos Landing, which is the first lake on the Allagash. As we were flying, I photographed Mount Katahdin, and you can see the river that flows into Telos in the foreground. This is a close-up map of the Allagash water system, and we ended up landing down in Telos area and worked our way up this route. The focus of our story is going to be right here, which was Eagle Lake, and that's where this incident happened. This is a picture of Jack on our first day out in the canoe, and this is of Jim and Chuck. The next image is of Chamberlain Lake, and when we landed on Telos down here and spent our first day, we had hoped to make it all the way to this point so that we might continue up to Allagash Lake up in the upper left-hand corner. We ended up not getting quite as far because there was a strong wind which blew from the north to the south all day and kind of impeded the progress that we had wanted to make. On our way up, we had seen two young fellows who were exploring many of the small little islands that jut up out of the lake. And we canoed up to this campsite right here. But because the wind was blowing down upon us, it was just too windy for us to dare start a fire. And we soon abandoned and came across to this point and set up with several other campers to be in the sheltered area of the lake. When we set up camp, the other campers asked, had we seen these two young men that we had seen earlier in the day, and we had told them that we had seen them. They immediately, as well as the four of us, began looking across the lake and trying to spot these guys that were missing. And while we were looking for them, one of the members of the other party spotted a strange light, which Jim immediately put his binoculars up upon. And we watched it, and we thought that it was a bit strange because it was moving quite slowly, but it was moving into the wind. Jim observed it for a few moments, and then it just basically winked out and disappeared. We didn't really think much more about it. We thought perhaps it was a light on some aircraft and it had turned and we were no longer seeing it. And then we ended up seeing these missing two fellas over at the campsite we had just abandoned.
There's one thing I would like to add as a bit of information on that light. When I focused in on it with my binoculars, the light immediately seemed to be a type of light I've never seen before. It had a velvety yellow quality to it. It wasn't white, it was something else, and it immediately struck me as being a little odd. And I actually observed it for about 30 seconds, and when it winked out, it didn't just wink out, it collapsed. It collapsed in on itself like an iris from the outside in, which I also thought was a little odd. I've never seen a light do that before, but we needed to set up camp, so we just said, well, whatever it was, it's gone. Let's get going and set up our campsite, because by that time it was nighttime.
So after we got up the following morning, packed our canoes up, and tried getting up to Allagash Lake, up north of this image here. Allagash Lake is around this area. It's a primitive lake, which was one of the reasons we wanted to go to it, because no boats with motors of any kind are permitted in this on this water. It's very pristine. But the current was so swift that paddle as hard as we could. And we were young guys in good shape. And the best we could do was to stay stationary in the stream. So we thought the best way we could progress was by getting into the water, attaching a rope to the canoe, and then walking against the stream, which we did. And we only made it to about here, to this little pond. And that was about the halfway mark. But it was getting on in the day, and we knew we didn't have the time or energy left to pursue going up to Allagash Lake. So we hopped in the canoes, and what had taken us all day long to get to this point took us about 20 minutes to get here. And so this is where we sat up this camp. This photograph was taken at that campsite on the river. The following morning, we went down to the portage, as it's sometimes called, which is right over here. And we took and carried our canoe the quarter-mile from Chamberlain over into Eagle Lake. Our original plan was to try and get down in as far to gain access to this area to do some fishing. Unfortunately, by the time we got out on the lake and got down, this is the area here circled that we set up our camp for the evening. This is a photograph that shows that end of the lake, which shows a lot of standing dead trees and good structure for fishing. And that was one of the things that we had really wanted to do on this trip, was to get in some great fishing. This next image is taken from our actual campsite. So once we got set up, we built a fire. We'd been building fires for many, many years. And we built a fire that we knew would last a good 2.5 hours, perhaps 3. The purpose for our fire was to act as a lighthouse beacon at night in this remote location. As in any area far away from the city, it gets extremely dark at night. You can feel the heat from your hand when your hand is held close to your face, but there's not enough light to see your hand. That's the reason we had built this fire. Well, after we built the fire, we then worked our way through all of this standing structure and worked our way down to the mouth area of the stream coming into Eagle Lake. That took us around 20 minutes or so to just slowly work our way through. Now, that evening, there were no breezes. The water was as clear and as flat as a glass mirror, and it reflected every star in the night sky. We had been fishing for just a few minutes when the other Chuck at the end of the canoe said, "What the hell's that?" And he said it with such emphasis that we all turned and looked in that direction. This painting, or this piece of artwork you're looking at, I did immediately upon returning to Boston from a small sketch I had in a journal I was keeping at the time. And I had made entries in this journal every single day until the following day of our fishing at this location. This sphere was, just as you see here, coming out from behind the trees. And it was this unusual image that I thought at first was the moon. But in less time than it took me to pronounce the word moon, I had already dismissed it as being the moon, because number one, it was way too close to the tops of the trees. and the moon has no yellow ambience to it. We watched this sphere as it came in. This is sort of like us in the water here, and our campfire across, and this is a stream coming in, feeding the lake. The surface sort of is emblematic to what you're looking at here. The sphere also had this unusual type of halo around it. The sphere began moving silently in our direction along the shoreline, remaining about 15 or 20 feet from the tops of the trees.
Charlie, can I add something to
Certainly.
thing, please? One of the things that you noticed about this sphere of light, when I turned around to look at it, I immediately recognized it as the same light that we had seen a few days prior when I was looking at it through my binoculars. And it wasn't just like a spotlight type of light. It had this roiling quality to it. I had been working in the ceramics department at Boston University at the time, going for a graduate degree, and I fired a lot of kilns. And the only way I could compare this light was if you look inside of a kiln at 2,300 degrees Fahrenheit, the heat actually becomes like a plasma, and it roils on the inside. If you look in what we call peepholes inside the kiln, you can see what the light looks like, and it looked just like that. It roiled around constantly like it was alive, and it was always moving, and it was very, very bright. I remember it was mostly a very whitish yellow, but then every now and then you'd see a little streak or a line of yellow or orangish yellow that seemed to pop out here and then recede again and then come out in another area. It didn't look solid at all. It looked like a big kind of fuzzy edge to it, like the halo. And it was huge. This thing was as big as a 2-story house. It had to be 60 or 80 feet diameter at least. And it was perfectly silent. It made no noise whatsoever. There was no hums, no whirs, no rotor blades. We sat and watched it for a few minutes trying to figure out what this thing was. I mean, it was both beautiful and terrifying. That's the only way I could describe it. And we thought, well, geez, is it a weather balloon? And we thought, well, I've never seen a weather balloon that looks like that. It's obviously not a helicopter. It's obviously not an airplane. We had no idea what this thing was, but we were totally transfixed by this thing, and it was really quite beautiful to look at.
As Jim was saying, as this sphere came down, it did have this halo around the sphere. If you've ever seen a halo around a full moon, it was sort of like that. Except that it was a very defined area that this halo engulfed, just as you see it in this piece of work. Also, the tops of the trees illuminated directly beneath it, and the trees did not move at all, which a helicopter, its prop wash pushing down to keep the craft in flight would make trees sway. You've all seen the way helicopters displace air beneath them, so they do it quite violently, and this was absolutely motionless as the trees, that is.
Just to give you an idea of who's who in Charlie's illustration here, this person here on this end of the canoe was Chuck Rack, and Jack and I were sitting in the middle with the fishing rods, and this is Charlie with the infamous flashlight.
They don't allow me to have flashlights in there. I don't know why.
But notice who's using the
pointer?
The pointer.
What can I say? Well, after I took the flashlight and I flashed three quick dashes, 3 longer dashes, and 3 short dashes, which is Morse code for SOS. I just did it to see what action or reaction or just what would happen. I was curious. We were all curious. Well, immediately after, it stopped. And then, this happened.
Now, this is one of the strangest kinds of lights I've ever seen, and I've never seen anything like it since. It wasn't like a spotlight beam. It was like a straw or a tube. And you can, if you look at the bottom where it's hitting the water, you can see the wall of the tube had this, it was a kind of a bluish, greenish, scintillating light. And the only thing I can compare it to is if you're in a room with a lot of dust floating around, and there's light coming through a window or a crack in the wall or something, and you can see the dust moving in the beam of light. That's what this thing did. It was unbelievable. And the inside of it was darker. It wasn't black, but it was much darker than the wall of the beam. I've never seen anything like this. And as soon as this came out of that, it started coming across the water right for our canoe. Now, we're in pitch dark at night in a 16-foot aluminum canoe. So we lit up like a Roman candle with this thing's light. And at that point, we thought, well, okay, whatever this is, let's deal with it on solid ground. Because we were really worried that if we tipped over and fell into the water, we'd get hung up on one of these half-submerged trees, and we'd drown. So at that point, Charlie, what's your favorite saying?
Well, let's run, but we were on the water, so.
His famous saying is, our curiosity was satisfied.
I did replace the flashlight with a canoe paddle, and we began paddling back toward our fire. I'm sitting in the front of the canoe, and I'm fixed. The only thing I'm focused on is our landing zone. That's the only thing I wanted my feet on dry ground. I paddled as hard as I could from the front of the canoe, and if anybody's done any canoeing, they'll testify that you have an incredibly difficult time to get a canoe to go in a straight line if you're paddling from the front. The person in the back normally will take their canoe paddle and they'll tilt it or move it at any angle to act as a rudder to direct the forward momentum of the canoe. Jack and Jim were using their hands to assist me, and they were encouraging me by hollering, "Paddle, Charlie, paddle!" I didn't really need a lot of encouragement.
Well, the reason we said that was because as we were paddling, my brother Jack and I looked back because we wanted to see where this thing was. And, when we first saw it, the end of the lake was probably 100 yards away from us. And it was moving fairly slowly. I mean, it came down over the water and started moving towards us. So we thought, well, okay, we'll get to land before this thing catches up to us. And Jack and I looked back, and instead of it being way back there, it was almost on top of us. And I remember Jack saying, "We're not going to outrun this thing, Jim." And I kept saying, and then we go, "Charlie, paddle, paddle."
Well, the next thing that seemed to happen to us, or for us, was the front of the canoes just hitting the sand at our campsite. Jack, Jim, and I scramble out of the canoe, and Chuck sets in the canoe. Well, at this point, the sphere was hovering perhaps about, 40 feet, maybe above the surface of the water. Again, this water is just like a sheet of glass. It's reflecting the sphere and all the stars. Well, now that I'm on dry land, I pick up the flashlight again. Hey, I can't drown.
Never learns.
So I shine the flashlight now at a second time. But this time, instead of a cone of light coming out or the light coming toward us, it began to move away from us. For some reason, I didn't know at the time, but I had this feeling that this thing was about to start moving quickly. So I took the flashlight and I shined it at my wristwatch, finding the sweep hand. I looked back up, and while I was doing this,
it winked out again. And at first, you know, you can see there's a beam of light coming out of the bottom here. That beam shifted up into the sky at about a 45-degree angle. And then it just collapsed in on itself, just like it had the
barely
previous
see it
nights
going
before.
off over there.
And a second later, it came on again, only it was much further away and much higher. And then it would wink out again, and then another second would go by and it would come on again, only it would be higher and further away. So each time it did that, it gave you the illusion that it was almost climbing up a flight of stairs. And that took about 4 or 5 seconds, maybe a little longer. And by 6, 7, 8 seconds later, this thing was just a star in the sky.
It's a pinpoint of light.
It's just a pinpoint of light like a star, and it swerved around to the southwest and then curved back up towards the northeast, and it disappeared over the tree line and was gone. And I mean, this thing was moving, no sonic signature at all.
I looked at my watch, and maybe 8 to 10 seconds from the time it began moving until we lost all sight of it at all, only 8 to 10 seconds had elapsed.
So we were standing on the beach of the lake in shock, basically. I mean, we weren't even talking, and we all felt extremely exhausted. I mean, you would think that after seeing something like this,
You'd be all pumped up,
you'd be all
excited.
pumped up and saying, "What the heck was that? And what just happened?" All we wanted to do was go to sleep.
Well, actually, what we did was we were exhausted, but we just attributed that to the exertion of paddling across the lake, and you know, the adrenaline leaving our systems. And we watched the night sky for a minute or two, a couple minutes, and then turned and walked up to picnic tables that are placed at these campsites. The 3 guys sat down, and I walked over to the campfire, and because I was puzzled by it. It sort of attracted my attention because it was nothing but embers, and I had been paddling toward a flame that was a couple of feet high off of the ground. And now this thing was embers. I didn't really spend a lot of time wondering about this, simply because, as you all know, if you build a fire, the fire's going to burn out. We were exhausted. So we ended up climbing into our sleeping bags and waking up the next morning. Well, the next morning, as we were breaking camp and making breakfast, the only thing we could talk about was this sighting that we had from that night. We were really excited, very animated about it, and we loaded up our 2 canoes and headed out to travel and continue going up the lake. As we were going up, we spotted a ranger out on the water, and we hailed him to our next campsite, and he came in, and we told him about what we had seen. And this fella gave us a strange look, cocked his head one way or the other, and then he said in this Maine accent, he goes, "Well, what you boys probably saw was them Hollywood-style searchlights that they've got down in Millinocket where they opened a brand new hardware store. And that's what you boys saw."
Yeah.
Yeah. So Millinocket is down here. We were up here. Oh, this sort of bump here, that's Mount Katahdin. It's 1 mile high. There were no clouds. I'm not an engineer. I don't know a lot of things, but I was pretty sure that a beam of light from a hardware store isn't going to travel 90 miles and chase us across the lake. So we didn't really push it with this fella, but we continued.
Did report it.
Yeah, we had reported it, and then we decided to continue on with our trip. Being kind of inventive young fellas, we were the first to sail on the lakes up there. We took 2 canoes, tied them, lashed them together to make sort of like a catamaran, and then we lashed 2 poles And the sail is my half-shelter poncho from when I was in the military. And we attached it with bungee cords. Jack and Jim, this is Jim here, Jack was in front of me. And they used their canoe paddles, had a bungee cord attached to them so we could catch the wind, and we tacked up Long Lake, trolling as we went along. We just continued on over the next several days on our canoe trip, pausing and stopping to tell rangers when we saw them about this encounter.
We also asked any campers that we came in contact with. There were a lot of people up there on the lake system. This is late August. And everyone we asked said they saw absolutely nothing. I mean, other than those set of campers that saw it the first time with us at a distance, every single person we asked said they didn't see a thing that night. You know, they said, hey, when it gets dark, we went to bed and went to sleep.
Which is normal behavior.
Normal behavior on the lake.
We even had our campsite searched by 2 rangers when we told them about having seen this. And I had been trying to break the cigarette smoking habit, and I had a small pipe that I had bought when I was in Holland that will fold up to the size of like a silver dollar, and you can put it in your shirt pocket. And the ranger looked at me and he says, boy, I don't know what you've been putting there, but I'd stick with tobacco. Well, the rest of our trip, we paddled the rivers, and we came to Chase Rapids. Chuck and I shot the rapids while Jack and Jim contacted another ranger and went around to meet us below the rapids with their gear.
Now, here's where a curious thing comes into this whole case. When we first landed on Telos Lake, the rangers come immediately to check you out. They come to make sure that you're, 1, not a fugitive, 2, you're not smuggling things across the border, 3, that you have enough supplies to survive out in the wilderness over whatever period of time you're up there for. And they also require that you camp only at designated campsites. And they want to see where those campsites are. You have to provide them a map with the campsites that you plan to be at when, so that if for any reason you come up missing, they have some idea to know where to start looking for you. And so when we showed the ranger our map on the first day, he noticed that we wanted to go to this one pond. It was called Haymock Pond, and it was connected to the southern end of Eagle Lake by Smith Brook. And he said, I'm not going to do the accent because I can't do the accent, only Charlie can. But he basically said, oh, you can't go there. You can't go to that end of the lake system. And we said, well, why not? You know, we heard that it's really good trout fishing on Haymock Pond. That's why we came up here. And he said, well, it's been a really dry summer. And so the water level is really, really low. And in fact, it's so low that the Smith Brook connecting Eagle Lake to Haymock Pond is unnavigable. So we've closed off those campsites down there, so you can't go there. And we said, well, yeah, okay, fine. And then as soon as we left, we're like, no, we're going there. That's how we wound up in that end of the lake system. When we went to Portage around the Chase Rapids, these are class 4 rapids, 2.5 miles. Jack and I had never done rapids, so we were a little afraid to do that. Yeah. And I approached one of the rangers. There was a ranger station there that you could set up portage arrangements. And I approached one of the rangers and asked them if they could portage Jack and I to the far end of the rapids. And he said, oh, well, I don't know why you're worried about the rapids. There are no rapids right now. And I said, excuse me, there's 2.5 miles. And he said, oh, we had a big rainstorm come through here about a week and a half ago, and it dumped so much water on the lake system that all the rocks are underwater. And I stopped and I said, well, that's confusing, because when we first landed on Telos Lake, the ranger said that the water level was really low this time of year. And the guy who gave me this funny look, and he goes, you're one of them guys, aren't you? And I was like, excuse me? And he said, you're one of them guys that saw that spaceship, aren't you? And I said, well, I don't know what we saw, but yeah, we're those guys. And he turned his back to me and walked away and would not talk to me. I had to go and arrange the portage arrangements with another ranger.
Well, after we ran into all the different rangers and so on, we finally came toward the end of the river, and you have your last portage, which is around Allagash Falls. And this is a photo from below the falls as we got onto the river to complete our trip. We ended up going up through Allagash Village, hitting the St. Francis River. Now the Allagash, if I hadn't mentioned, is one of two rivers in Maine that flow north. And they were used quite extensively in the logging era when they used to float logs across the lakes and the rivers. But the last day of our trip, we were trying to find, it was damp and drizzly, which is the reason you see Jim and Jack wearing the rain slickers, and we were looking for some dry wood so we could cook up the last of our, previously freeze-dried food. We'd been eating like lentil bean stew and things like that, and it was so, we wouldn't eat it anymore. And we'd put it out and the chipmunks wouldn't eat it. So, as we were looking for some dry wood, now this portion of the river is near Fort Kent, and it's right beside Route 1. I believe that's the route that is up there. And we encountered this gentleman, Harry Smith. Well, he took a shine to us, and as we were talking to him, he asked us what we were doing. We were telling him how we had just finished canoeing, and so he said, what are you doing? I said, well, we're looking for some dry wood to make a breakfast fire. He said, all right. He says, you stay there, I'll be right back. A little while later, he returned with dry wood, fresh eggs, bacon, and some coffee, and so we had our final breakfast and shared it with Harry. And he told us all about logging in the early days of his youth, as well as running Canadian whiskey into the U.S. across the St. Francis. So after that, we made our way back to Boston, and once in Boston, we started telling all our friends about our trip and about being chased by a UFO. I mean, because heck, we were the only ones I ever knew got chased by a UFO. The type of UFO we saw was this spherical type, which is numbered 6, and this I found from a NICAP manual. So I don't know where they get all their data, but I got it from them. So, and this brought us back after about 2 years later. Jim was up in northern Maine helping a friend, and he had an accident.
Yeah, I was in the wonderful town of Calais, and I was helping a friend move into a house for the summer. He was renting it for his family. And the house had a room closet that had a stairwell that went into the basement, second floor, and the owners tore the stairwell out. And it's a little more complicated than I'm going to make it sound, but I managed to go into the closet and go straight 2 stories down into the basement. And I did a somersault, landed in a sitting position, right on a straight back sitting position with my tailbone. I broke all the vertebrae in the base of my back, ruptured all the disc, and I rammed my spinal cord up into my head. And I immediately went into shock. The friend that was with me ran to a house next door because we were in the town, and he called the cottage. They didn't have a hospital then. This is 1978, but they had a cottage and they had 1 ambulance. So he said, get the ambulance here right now. This terrible thing has happened, and this guy's going into shock. And they said, oh, we're sorry, the ambulance just left 10 minutes ago to go pick up a baby for adoption in a neighboring town and bring it back. And I don't know what the exact words were that he said. I'm sure I couldn't repeat them if I wouldn't repeat them even if I knew. But it was something like, you get them here now. And so they said, all right, we'll reroute the ambulance. And when the ambulance got the call, they were literally right in front of the house.
Wow.
So they just pulled up the driveway. So he ran out through a bulkhead entrance from the basement. And when they came back in, they said, well, we're sorry, this guy's gone, he's got no pulse, and we're really sorry. And my friend said, he was alive when I came out to meet you, you bring him back now. So one of the paramedics started giving me CPR, and I don't remember if they brought me back that way or if they got paddles, but somehow or another they revived me just in the nick of time. And I spent a long time in the hospital. They had to put me in the ambulance and ship me down to Mass General Hospital in Boston because they just couldn't deal with the extent of the injuries up in Calais. And it took me many, many years of recovering from this injury. It left me with permanent spinal damage, permanent brain damage, which over the years has turned into epilepsy. I developed temporal limbic epilepsy from the whole thing. But I'm still on this side of the turf, so that's a good thing. But it took many years for me to recover from it, and during that time, I was constantly going into one of the local hospitals in Boston. Beth Israel had a very, very good neurology and epilepsy clinic. So I was always going in there, and one of the problems I started having, probably it was the early 80s, was I started developing these horrible nightmares where I think I was awake, but there would be these forms, like human people or something moving around my bed, and they would be touching me and trying to pull me out of my bed, and it would absolutely terrify me. And I would have these all the time. And it got to the point where I was so disturbed that I would, regardless of what time of year it was, before I would go to bed at night, I was living in a house with Charlie and some other roommates. We were all sharing an apartment in Brookline. And I would go around the house at night and literally make sure that every window and every door was locked. And I would literally padlock myself in my bedroom. That's how terrified I was, because I didn't know what was happening, and I thought one of my roommates was sneaking in and out of my room at night, which was totally illogical. But that's what I did for years. And I couldn't sleep. I was having a lot of sleep deprivation, and because I was having sleep deprivation, my seizure activity was going through the roof. So about 1988, I was in the hospital again, being treated for the seizures. And they were doing a long-term electroencephalogram study on me. And so I had all this stuff attached to my head, and I couldn't move in the bed, and I was bored staring at the ceiling. So I asked one of the nurses if she could bring me something to read. And I don't know where she got this. I think it was out in the waiting room. But she walked in and plopped down Whitley Strieber's book for me to read. And at that time, I had no idea who Whitley Strieber was. And when I saw the face on this book, I just flipped. And I became really irate and irrational, and I had a fit. And so later, one of the neurology team psychiatrists, his name was Jonathan Weinberg, very nice man, came in and questioned me about why I had this reaction. And I said, well, I see these things in my dreams. I'm having these nightmares, and this his face. And he said, I'm going to ask you a question, Jim, and I want you to answer me honestly. And I said, well, yeah, fine. And he said, have you ever seen a UFO? And I was like, what? I was like, yeah, as a matter of fact, I have. But what's that got to do with my seizures? I don't want to talk about UFOs. Let's deal with the seizure disorder here. And he said, well, the reason I asked you this is because I just had dinner about a week ago with a colleague of mine. It happened to be Dr. John Mack. He said, and Dr. John Mack is working with some patients that have are having these same dreams. And I think there's a connection here. I don't know what it is, but I think there's a connection here to your nightmares. And I want you to talk to somebody in the UFO community. And I said, absolutely not. This is totally ridiculous. I don't even want to talk about this. This is stupid. And I refused at first. And so he went away until I calmed down a little bit. And then he came back again and said, look, Jim, I really want you to do this. Do it for me, please. Because I think this is what you need. And so he arranged for me to have a meeting with this guy named Raymond E. Fowler, another person I never heard of. But at the time, Ray was, I think, he was like chief investigator, Massachusetts chief investigator for MUFON. And he was going to be in one of the neighboring towns a week later. So the psychiatrist set up a meeting with Ray, and I went to this convention, something very similar to this. It was a UFO convention, and Ray was there selling his books. So I introduced myself, and he was a little wary. I think he really didn't even want to be bothered at first, and I told him about our experience on the Allagash, and during the storyline, I mentioned that I had an identical twin, and when I said identical twin, he stopped and said, wait a minute, did you say identical twin? And I said, yes, I did say that. So then that seemed to pique his interest a little bit, so he closed down his book table, and he took me aside and said, all right, I want to hear this from beginning to end again. Don't leave out any details. So I went through the whole thing again. Now you have to understand, at this time, we had no idea. I mean, all we believed happened was we was chased across the lake by this UFO. That's all.
Let me add this. At the same time that Jim was going through these nightmares and his strange behavior with the padlocks, his brother up in Vermont, Jack, was having identical nightmares. The nightmares involved 3 other people besides the person having the nightmare. They were always the same 3. The other twin and Chuck and myself. But Jack had Mary to confide in, and he only confided into her. He didn't even confide with Jim.
Yeah,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, everybody has nightmares, right? And so, you don't go around, whining about your nightmares at night. You might say, yeah, I didn't sleep good, I had nightmares, end of story. So we never really communicated between one another about what was going on. So I didn't know he was having these nightmares. He knew I was having nightmares, but, I just said, well, they're nightmares. And anyway, after talking to Ray, he asked if he could do a report on this sighting in Maine. So we agreed to do that, and he started the process of doing an official MUFON report. He went in and did background checks on all of us. He asked us for names of people that we knew, family names. He contacted the rangers in Maine and asked them about, did we talk to them? And they said, yes, we remember these guys. They filed an official report.
Plus he contacted the people. He had asked for a list of people that we could remember that we had told about our experience in 1976. So this would have been September, October, November, and for about the next 12 months until we told everybody that we knew about being chased by a UFO.
Right. So eventually it got to the point where he said, listen, would you guys consider undergoing hypnotic regression? And we said, well, okay, if you recommend that, do you think it's worthwhile? And he said, yeah, I would like to do that. And he hired a professional hypnotist, a man named Tony Constantino, who was very professional. And they arranged to have all 4 of us go in for hypnotic regression sessions. So I went first. And when I went in, I knew nothing about hypnotic regression or hypnosis. I always thought it was a carnival act. You get hypnotized, they make you cluck like a chicken and quack like a duck. And that's about the end of it. But anyway, they explained it that it's just really a deep state of relaxation that helps you kind of remember things without being distracted by noise or outside, distractions. And he said, listen, I want you to promise me that you not talk about anything that you remember in these hypnotic regression sessions. I do not want you to mention to the other guys, because I'm doing you all independent of one another, and I don't want what you remember in your session to influence or pollute the other guy's session. So we all agreed to that, and we did do that. None of us spoke about anything that came out of our independent sessions. When I went in for my first session, they put me in a deep state of relaxation, hypnosis, and they brought us back to that night on the Allagash when we saw this thing coming out, chasing us back over the water. And at that point, I started remembering more. And I remembered that after Jack and I looked back to see where this thing was and realized it was almost on top of us, the next thing I remembered was this thing was directly over us. And then this tube of light came down and surrounded our canoe. And I remember having this feeling like every molecule in my body was about to explode. I didn't feel any heat, but it was a kind of internal pressure. And it was very uncomfortable. It was absolutely terrifying. And the next thing I remembered was the guy that was facing me in the front of the canoe, Chuck Rapp. He just vanished. And at first I thought he fell into the water, and then the next thing I remembered was sitting somewhere in a room. And I had, my vision was affected. I could see clearly directly in front of me. Everything was in perfect focus, but everything on my peripheral was fuzzy. I couldn't make out details of any kind whatsoever. It was almost as if I had Vaseline on the outside of my eyeballs that was making everything blurred. And I was trying to focus because I saw some figures in front of me. And when I focused right in front of me, I noticed that one of them was my brother, Jack. He was in his, I think he was wearing pants, he had a shirt off, and there was another person standing in front of him that was directly in front of him. It was about almost as high as he was. And then Jack took the rest of his clothes off, and they just kind of dropped them on the floor, and then these other figures came out around Jack, and I can't remember, it was another 3 or 4 total, I think. And at first, Tony, the hypnotist, kept saying, well, who are these people? What do they look like? Can you describe them? And I said, well, they're skinny, they look bony, but I couldn't make out their faces at first. It was just something that was blocking my memory of what these things' faces looked like. And I was very agitated. I didn't know what was going on. And eventually, they would take me a little deeper into the hypnotic state. And eventually, I was able to see the faces on these things. And when I saw what they were, I completely snapped. I remember screaming, "My God, they're bugs!" And they had a face that looked like an insect, and they had these big, like eyes, like insect eyes. That they weren't on the front of their heads; they were more to the side of their heads. The heads weren't vertically oriented like ours; they were a little bit like if you lift your chin up, so they were a little bit more horizontal. They had a large head. I mean, they looked like an insect to me. I was completely freaked at that point in time. And one of these creatures had a wand. It was like a long, thin wand, and they were like poking Jack around under his neck and on his face. And another one was taking his arm and articulating his arm in a way that I thought for sure they were going to break it. All I could think about was, my God, they're going to dislocate his arm. And I was thinking, like, what is going on? What's happening? Where am I? And so then they walked Jack off. These two of these things. They had thin necks, very thin arms. They had 4 fingers that were opposing. They seemed to have a crease on their hand where they could oppose the 4 fingers.
We have, as Jim was saying about their hands. We have some illustrations of Jack.
Yeah, we'll get to them, and Jack and Charlie did some really good illustrations. We'll get to those in a minute. But anyway, they walked him off out of this room into like some kind of hallway, I remember, and then they came back and they came for me. And I thought, oh God, this is insane. Now what's going to happen? I mean, you have to understand, I was in a complete state of terror. I've never had a state of terror like that before. And so I was pretty scared. And when they came for me, I was like, no, I'm not going. Wherever you want to take me, I am not going there. And one of them immediately took this wand device and they stuck it into my rib cage. And I didn't get any like visual spoken message in my head, but I had this clear impression that I must comply, I must cooperate, and if I didn't, they were going to force me to. So I went with them. They took me into this room, and the next thing I remembered under the hypnosis was being on a table. Some kind of examination table, and there was one of these creatures was on either side of me, and there was another one on the bottom, and they were examining me, and I felt like a polar bear, like when our scientists go to the North Pole and they dart a polar bear and they were examining them and doing all these things, checking their teeth. That's what they were doing, and then they started playing around with my genitals. And I got this clear impression like, oh boy, this is getting crazy. If they want a sperm sample, they're not going to get it because, I was about as small as you can get from terror. And it was really hard to talk about. But then all of a sudden my mind started flooding with these sexual images. And they came out with some kind of device, and they got their sperm sample, and they took some tissue samples from me. Then I thought, like, wow, okay, now here comes the dissection. So I was like, it's either now or never. I got to get out of here now. That was what was going through my mind. And I know this sounds horrible, but I actually thought that if I could grab one of these things, maybe I could snap its neck, because they were really thin, and create some kind of distraction and just get the hell out of there. And as soon as I had that thought, these two beings that were standing on either side of this table, just like in a blink of an eye, moved 10 feet away from me. And then one of them put its hand up, and it's the weirdest thing. The way these things would get devices, they would like put their hands up in the air, and there was nothing in their hands. And when they come back, they'd have something in their hands, and they had this thing like a hockey puck. It was like a concave hockey puck. They had two of them, and they put one on each of my shins. And then I couldn't move my legs. I was completely paralyzed. And for years afterwards, I've always had these two patches of completely bare skin on my legs where the hair didn't grow for years. Perfectly the shape of these devices.
Oh, also, where these hockey puck-like things were on Jim's ankles, his brother Jack developed some type of tumor in the same areas on his legs. And we have some photographs of the scars where these were surgically removed from Jack and then sent off for pathology analysis. They ended up going to the Air Force Institute of Pathology, which handles a lot of unknown types of tissues. I don't know why they get it, but Ray tracked down through the hospital that Jack had the surgery done in. The last documents that Jack has were signed by a colonel in the Air Force who was a medical pathologist, and no more information was received after the signature paper that the Air Force had received them.
So I didn't remember a whole lot, to be honest with you, because I was in such a state of terror that that Ray and Tony were afraid I was going to start having seizures, and on some occasions I actually did start having some tonic-clonic seizures, which is, muscle jerks. So they would immediately bring me out for fear that I would have a grand mal seizure. So they got very little out of me. I did manage to draw an image of what they looked, their faces. I'm not a very good illustrator. Charlie and Jack and the other guy were much better illustrators than me. My specialty is ceramics. That was pretty much all they got out of me. And then Charlie and Jack and the other guy went through. Charlie, you may want to start going through some of yours and Jack's speeches.
When I had myself gone up for the hypnotic regression, I didn't have a lot of faith in it myself. I knew what had happened. I knew we had gone out on the lake. We were fishing. We saw this strange thing. It chased us back to shore. It flew away. Total story. But after being regressed, the first thing I remember is being in this extremely brilliantly illuminated room. My eyes, as Jim had just described, my eyes, I could not see very far. My eyes felt like they were extremely dilated, like anyone that's had an eye exam when the physicians put the dilation drops in your eyes. My eyes were affected by this light in a similar fashion. I could not see very far, nor could I see extremely clearly, but I could I was lifting my head up because I found myself flat on my back, and the first thing that I saw was that I didn't have my socks on. And then I was wondering where my shoes were, and then, the rapid thinker I am, I realized I didn't have any clothing on, and then, where the hell am I, was my last thought. I could then basically make out just beyond my feet my three companions sitting on this bench that seemed to just protrude out of a wall area. And they're just sitting there like they're waiting for a bus. I couldn't speak or say anything, but I was like screaming in my own mind. I was screaming, "Help me, you bastards, get up and help me." But they didn't move, and as I was struggling along, this image shows a device that came down over our chest, and this is just as best as I can type of illustrate it, that this panel came down over my chest and enveloped my upper torso in this same quality bluish light that this beam that had come from the bottom of the sphere had the same type of quality. Well, as I was lifting my head and struggling and fighting, all of a sudden this head just peered down that I was not aware was there. And this is what I saw. So I immediately tried to move as quickly away from it as I could, and my head hit the top of the table. And as Jim was just mentioning a few minutes ago about their hands, they had these bizarre hands, not like ours with 4 digits and one opposable thumb. They had an articulating joint, I'll call it for lack of a better term, in what would be the palm of the hand. So the 4 fingers could then spread, and they had 4 opposable digits. There's another one. You'll see it's turning around. Well, when my eyes made contact with this face, I had a sensation that was in one way physically similar to dropping on a roller coaster when it goes for its deep dive, or being on an elevator that lurches or something. My conscious mind seemed to be sucked up into the presence of this thing's thought processes. I was told that if I complied, I would be fine, but not necessarily in English. I don't know. I was just given this more or less command to behave myself, but I felt reassured, so I did no longer struggle or fight. This is an illustration that Jack had done of the way the hand could hold this fine wand that Jim had just described a bit earlier. Now, my memories are not chronological. They sort of like are snippets that bounce here, and there, and back. And I remember from being on my back, I also recall standing in front of like this portal or something that had the same quality of tingling, moving borders that I kind of tried to depict here. And I could see the canoe empty, floating in the water, and I could see our campfire. And the only thought in my mind was, I want to be in the canoe. I have to be in the canoe. I should be in the canoe. But I wasn't in the canoe. This is, now my artwork, that these images that you've seen, were done independently. We all, just like our hypnotic regression and the reports that we filled out for Ray, we all did them independently of one another. And Ray had asked for us to do some artwork. Now, you just saw a couple pieces of mine. This is one that Jack did. And it shows him being examined on a table with a panel over his chest. And this is an illustration of the disc that had been placed on Jim's ankles, as he had just described a short while ago. One of the things that went on besides the exam on the table were being taken to some sort of other room or area where this is one that Jack had done, shows this brightly lit chamber. And when he was in this room, placed on his back, he had this pulsation of light and a type of energy emanating through him. He said it kind of reminded him of taking a giant tuning fork and pinging it and having your entire body vibrate or oscillate, like putting a tuning fork behind your ear. And these are some of these images of this experience that he had. This is a rendering that Jim had done of his of the beings. This is one of Jack's. It's another one of Jack's. This is one of mine that I had done later. This is another one of mine, and again, you can see the way the hands operated. These are some more drawings of the hands. And one of the things is we were talking about the hands having the opposable digits. Oops, sorry. This is one of these devices. What its purpose was, I have no idea. But this device could only be used with 4 opposing digits, and you can see the way the hand could wrap around this instrument. This instrument is the one that was used for collecting seminal fluids, as we had briefly mentioned. And as I had talked about the area that Jim has no hair growing on his leg. These are the areas where the tumors were removed from Jack's leg. And this is the surgical scar that was left behind. This illustration or rendering is one that Jack had done of the type of like clothing or uniform that these beings were wearing. And they had a device that, to me, and to Jack as well, and probably the rest of us, sort of looked like a belt buckle, but it was actually some type of instrument or device that they used for many purposes. One being, one evening in 1993, I was up at Jack and Mary's, and they had a folding futon bed down on the first floor. Their bedroom was up on the second floor. And their house is built on the exact 4 points of the compass, north, south, east, and west. And when I had turned in that evening, the moon was full moon and clearly visible through the eastern window in the kitchen. The sliding glass doors that you see, that you see here are due directly south, and this is the west-facing window. Well, for some reason I sat bolt upright and wide awake, and they had a small miniature schnauzer named Ixley. And Ixley had this habit of finding one sock in your shoe and turning it into doggy bubblegum. So when you get up in the morning, you had one soggy, saliva-covered sock and one dry one. Well, I immediately checked my shoes and I looked around for Ixley, but I didn't see him, and my socks were safely tucked deep under my shoes and the dog couldn't get at them. So I was puzzled as to why I had awakened and could figure out no reason for it. So I looked straight out the sliding glass door in front of me, noticed that the yard there was illuminated, and you can see there's trees off here, and that's because there's like a little portion of woods that comes toward their house, and then they have this little clear opening of a yard. Well, I figured since the yard was illuminated, it was the moon directly above the house, and so I laid back down and rolled over into my right side facing the west window. Well, when I did, I could see that the moon was clearly visible in the west window, so I sat back up again and I looked out the sliding glass doors. Well, when I did, this is what I saw. This group has standing there, they were looking up at this illumination in the sky, and then the tallest of the group turned his head and looked directly at me. Well, when it did, the rest turned like a flock of birds or a school of fish in the same snappy movement, and they looked directly at me, and then they began coming toward me. Well, when I was 10 years old, I knew what to do if something came at you. You run like hell. So I could run a lot faster at this age than I could when I was 10. But what I did was I laid flat down and I pulled the covers over my head, saying, "And hell with this, I know what this is all about." And I don't behave this way, but I did that evening. Well, the next morning at breakfast, I was kind of like embarrassed by this, but I thought it was just some kind of weird, bizarre dream. And I started sharing it with Jack and Mary. When Mary looks at Jack and says, "Oh my God, tell him, Jack," because he was looking at her and her at him like husbands and wives do, with that communication that a couple build up over a lifetime of being married. And then Jack turned and looked at me and he said, "Charlie, I was going to tell you this. I haven't told you this yet, but 2 weeks ago, I woke up in the middle of the night thinking that Ixley wanted outside. I came down the stairs, I looked at the sliding glass doors, and I saw these three beings walk up to the glass door. One put his hand on this belt buckle device, and then the three of them just walked right through the door, right through it, not opening it, but right through it. And I said, the hell with this, I know what it's all about. And I ran up, I jumped in bed and covered my head up. And Mary said, yeah, that night I dreamt that there were 6 deer standing around our bed.
Deer with big eyes.
Deer with big eyes.
Yeah.
Well, this is jumping a bit forward, but in 1995, I had this strange dream, again, one evening, that I attributed to being the Allagash, an Allagash-related dream. I dreamt that I had been picked up. I had an escort on either arm that held my arm with 2 hands and more or less moved me forward. That next morning, I'm talking with Jim and telling him that I had this strange dream. And he said, geez, that's really strange, Charlie. He had a similar dream the same night. And then he says this curious thing to me. Did you happen to see the ivy on the house next door across from your window?
Yeah, at this time, Charlie and I were living in the same house, but my wife and I were living in
It was a two-family house.
We were living on the downstairs, and Charlie was living upstairs, and his bedroom was directly above ours. That same night, I woke up at exactly 3:32 a.m., and looking out of one of our windows, I noticed this blue blinking light. The light would come on, and it would slowly get brighter and brighter and brighter for 3 or 4 seconds, and then it would go out again, and then it would come on again and get brighter and brighter and brighter, and then go out. And I thought it was a police car in our driveway, because this is the house next door to us.
They were only separated by the width of the driveway.
The width of the driveway. So I thought there was a cop in the driveway, and when I tried to get out, I couldn't move in my bed. It was like somebody was pushing me down into the bed, and I just could not move. And I remember telling my wife, Carol, wake up, wake up. And she was dead to the world. And then that's the last thing I remembered, except when I woke up the next morning, I had this vague flash memory of walking towards the corner of the bedroom where there's no door, and there were somebody else was in the room, and that's all I remember. When I went outside, I was smoking at the time, and I went outside to have a cigarette. When I looked next door at the house, that is what I saw, or something very similar to that. This is a photograph. This is a photograph that I took about a month later, so that it's not as...
Oh, it was a few days.
Yeah, okay. It was some time afterwards, but there was this perfectly round circle around these windows, and I don't know if you've ever tried to remove ivy from a house, but it's really
a stucco house.
Stucco. And there was nothing there. It was just like somebody sucked a perfectly round disc of the ivy right off the house. And so I said to Charlie, did you see the house next door? And he said no. So I went and grabbed him, and we went out and saw this. And I actually went next door and asked the people who lived there what they did to the house. They had no idea what I was talking about. And so I took them out and showed them, and the weird thing was like, oh yeah, okay, I don't know what that is, and I turned around and walked back in the house, like nothing happened. Well, anyway, to make a long story short, Charlie, show them the composite that you made.
Yeah, this is a marriage of this photograph and the previous one to give you an orientation of where this was on the house.
Scale. So this is actually a composite that Charlie had made, just for the record.
And this is an illustration, a line work, to show you where the hole in the ivy was, and then where Jim and Carol's room was, as opposed to where my room was. And I felt that I was being taken to this corner of my room. Jim felt that he was taken to that corner of his room.
Yeah. So Charlie and I actually explored this with hypnotic regression with Bud, and he put us both under independent hypnotic regression, and it does appear as if we had another abduction event. This was in '95 in the middle of Boston. I don't want to get into too much details because we've got to move along. We've got a lot more to cover yet and not much time left.
Well,
but eventually that's what came out of this. It appeared as if we had another abduction event.
well, one of the things that we're going to go into now is how our lives immediately were impacted or changed after the Allagash. All of our artwork underwent a progression. This is a painting that Jack had done, and this was the type of paintings he was creating when I first met him when he was in college. In fact,
before the Allagash.
this is before the Allagash, and this is a poster that he had done that's part of the permanent collection in the Smithsonian Institute down in D.C. Jack also has a few other pieces of artwork in the Museum of Fine Art and a couple of other museums around the Boston location. But he went from doing that type of art to becoming involved in these mathematical grids and complex, movements of grids, interlocking.
Yeah, at that time, Jack and I were living together, and so Jack had his studio in the house. I was still going to doing graduate studies at the Boston University's program in archery. And I remember I'd go into his studio, and he was obsessed with this kind of geometry and mathematics and grid structures. And I used to say, Jack, what are you doing? He'd say, I have no idea what I'm doing, but I can't stop. I got to do this. I got to do this. He just could not stop. He would do this around the clock, day in and day out. He had no idea what was going on, but all he knew was he had to do this.
Another thing with doing this type of mathematical composition, and he was doing it in 3 dimensions as well, was his obsession with learning mathematics. And I mean, complex mathematics. I mean, mathematics I can't even spell, let alone understand how they work. But he went into quantum mathematics, into trigonometry, and he just became consumed with this.
Yeah, this went on for years, and many years later, I mean, this was in the 90s, I think even after the book was published in '93, we finally came across some books. One was by David Hatcher Childress called Anti-Gravity in the World Grid, and a friend of ours who worked for MIT brought it over to the house, and he said, I think I know what Jack was doing all this time. And he showed us this book, and it turned out that the mathematics Jack was doing was almost identical to what we now know as the world grid and the Becker-Hagen's model of unified vector geometry, which Jack had no idea existed when he was making these sculptures.
A lot of these ley lines and these grids are where ancient temple sites are, such as Angkor Wat or Stonehenge, or many churches.
Almost all of them. Teotihuacan, Tiwanaku, Baalbek, you name one, and they're all
every continent.
They're all part of this grid. And what's so odd about this whole phenomenon is that, and I find really interesting, is this obsessive behavior, compulsive behavior that commonly follows some abduction events, where these people become suddenly obsessed with some idea. A housewife gets abducted, and all of a sudden she's building an anti-gravity engine in her basement. We knew a guy who was a clerk at a Club Med in the Caribbean who, after he was abducted, wanted to be a firewalker. I became completely obsessed with temple architecture, ancient temple architecture, and I don't know why I had this obsessive-compulsive thinking about this, but I truly believed that all the ancient temple sites on the world were part of a macro computer technology of some sort. That it was like, instead of having a computer with a motherboard with microchips on it, that all these temples were part of a macro computer on the planet that incorporated the energy of the planet into the temple structure itself.
Let me just interject for a quick second. One of the things that Jack did with his mathematics was, upon moving to Vermont, he became employed working in the astro-scientific field, where he coded lenses and filters that were used in a space program. Lenses that he coded and using this extreme mathematics that he did to bond onto glass, optical glass, used for the repair package in the Hubble Space Telescope. He also has lenses and filters on 3 of the Mars rovers and orbiting satellites, as well as numerous other things. These are just the last types of artwork that Jack is currently working on now.
Yeah, he's recently been diagnosed with primary progressive MS, and so he's limited to a wheelchair now. But he still does artwork, mostly on the computer and Photoshop. This is some of the recent stuff that he did. We only have 3 examples here, but I guarantee you there's at least 300 more that we haven't showed you.
And this was where Jim was just beginning to...
Yeah, we can step through these. This was some of the stuff I got into on this whole ancient technology, macro grid, micro grid stuff. Now, what's interesting, what I found out over years of research with this, is that, in fact, the book was just published in 2008. I think it'll come up here later on. A Chinese guy did a PhD thesis on the mounds in Europe and Central America and South America. And he came to the conclusion that mounds like Newgrange, Angkor Wat, Teotihuacan, Cuicuilco in Mexico's, near Mexico City, were all basically capacitors. That the types of materials that they used to make these things and layer them. For example, keep it on this one for just a second, please, Charlie. One of the things he found out was the way some of these things were constructed was in layers of different materials that were alternated between electrically conductive materials and non-electrically conductive materials, which is commonly called a dielectric. And when they were excavating the Temple of the Sun in Teotihuacan, a subfloor structure, which was not ornamental, it was part of the structure of this temple, huge, as big as this room. They found a foot-thick slab of mica that came from South America, 2,000 miles away. And in fact, not in just that period, but one of the other periods that Charlie showed was the Temple of the Moon with a courtyard with these other smaller temples. Same construction in those temples. Same kind of construction in Cuicuilco in Mexico, which happens to be arguably one of the oldest pyramidal structures in the world. There's a volcano nearby that erupted, and part of the lava flow went over this structure, and they dated the lava flow between 8,000 and 10,000 BC. So this guy came up with this conclusion that these structures were actually incorporating Earth energies, Earth frequencies, that telluric energies from the Earth, and they were being used somehow as some type of network of capacitors. There's Newgrange, same thing. And it's all, these are worldwide, this kind of technology. You could pick a country, you'll find a temple that uses the same architecture. This is the book by Won-Chuk Bong. I think it was published in 2008. So, you know, when you go into these things, you go into these obsessive belief systems, it really leads you on a quest, which I find fascinating, because I find this with many abductees, experiencers that Charlie and I have come in contact with. It seems to be a common denominator.
These are some of the books that were tied into the types of structures and technologies that we see reflected in our current modern technologies.
Keep going, John. Yeah. This is the guy that discovered the layers of mica in Teotihuacan's Temple of the Sun. Oh no, I'm sorry. This is Arthur Poznansky. He's the one that spent 20 years at Tiwanaku and Pumapunku in Bolivia. A very interesting character. He's in one of Zichen's books. I do a lot of reading.
Well,
this is Tiwanaku.
This is typical work that Jim had done prior to the Allagash.
I wish I had more slides. It's the only one that still exists. But this was, my background in ceramics goes way back to childhood, and I come from a Pennsylvania German tradition of pottery making, which was pretty simple, almost minimalist, total utilitarian. And this is what I was working on before we went to the Allagash, and immediately after coming back from the Allagash, I started making this stuff. These are pieces that I made immediately after coming back to the Allagash over the next year. I won't get into the chemistry or the technology. I do all my own chemistry on my clay bodies, my glazes, firing techniques. They're all my own, and they came to me on the Allagash the day after the event. I mean, I hate to say epiphany, but that's how it hit me, like a bolt of lightning. After the accident, I had to give up ceramics. I walked away from it for almost 25 years, and I started doing it again in 2003. And the next set of slides you'll see, this is some photography that I did when while I walked away. I got into photography and digital imaging with computers. I taught Photoshop for 10 years at Mass College of Art. This is some of my Photoshop, some of my digital artwork. Just a small sample. We'll go through this pretty quickly. I do a lot of experimentation, a lot of compositing with images. This is the image I went around the world with from the Storm Show. This is called Neurolithic Diagnostic. One of the other things I became obsessed with was petroglyphs. And this is part of a triptych called Bresson's Dream, which is about Cartier-Bresson, the famous French photographer. It's all done in Photoshop. Our little ubiquitous UFO up there.
Notice all the grid work you got in it?
Yes, I do. This is another image I did. It's called UFO. This is my lovely wife, Carol. One of our cats who's no longer with us, so she really is now a spooky cat. This is the next series of slides is pottery that I've been doing since 2003. I started doing it again, and this is what I've been doing ever since. When I sit down, this is mostly wheel work. When I sit down at the wheel, I mean, I have a bad back. Every morning when I get up, I don't know if I'm going to be walking by the end of the day. That's the state of my lower back. But I can sit down at a wheel, a pottery wheel, 8 o'clock in the morning, and not move till 10 o'clock at night. And when I get up, I have more energy when I leave than when I sat down. I don't know why, but that's the way it is. So this is my latest stuff. That piece, go back to that piece. I don't know if you recognize this, but this was the one that was in Bud Hopkins'
Bud's kitchen that the little girl was putting
girl
the
had
rabbit in.
a rabbit in. You can step through these pretty quick.
Give everybody a chance to look at them.
There's a couple of pictures of details. This is mostly detail stuff on surface that I do. Little surface studies. Here's my, I don't know what these things are or where they come from. They just come out of my brain.
Oh, I dated the one on the left.
Was it fun, Charlie?
Cosmic.
So was it good?
You look almost.
She looked like that in the morning, though, so I left.
You remind me of the Navajo petroglyphs.
So in my artwork, basically I've been a very traditional artist. landscapes, and those are pretty much the things I'm returning to. But upon returning from the Allagash, I was obsessed with medicine and medical technology and went on to become a medical illustrator. At first, my first and early works were pen and ink, and then I moved on to more complex work, doing color and so on and so forth. I only put 2 samples in there because most of the things I did were really graphic. So this is these are some of the watercolors I've done. Traditional type things, the Constitution. This is a Belgian draft horse. This is some of my more current work. I'm working on some portraiture and working with live models, trying to hone my skills a little bit. This is a pastel and a watercolor and another watercolor. And I just started doing oils just 3 months ago. I began doing oils again for like the first time in 30 years. And these are a couple of portraits and a couple of landscapes that I've just been out working on. This is a photograph I had taken in Nevada of some petroglyphs when Jim and I were out there in, this is Jim, in 2008. One of the things, the petroglyphs that are way up here, and it's like almost a sheer straight face to get up there. So one of the things that I still do and still love to do is fish. And since Jim and Jack refused to go fishing with me over the past few years,
It's too good.
they're afraid of flashlights. This is my fishing buddy, Dan. And this is me just a couple of months ago. And these are just some samples of some of the photography work I do, as well as doing some paintings. These were taken down in Newport. I also do a little sculpting. And this is some miniatures that I've done. I recently began doing ships in bottles and doing some figure sculpture work. And I had a dream a couple of nights ago about hybrid children, but I'm not sure if it was what it was, but well, we'll just skip beyond that. We'd like to again thank you, thank Ray Fowler.
Charlie, can we hold it there for just 1 minute? I'm sorry if we turned this into an art class, but the reason we did this is because we still have problems dealing with all this abduction stuff, and this is the way we deal with it. This is how we
Art, little humor.
how we cope with our lives from day to day, and you have to do something to keep the terror out and the night sweats. I still have horrible nightmares, not every night, but on occasion. I still have terribly frightening nightmares where some of these memories come back. And so the reason we wanted to show you the artwork was in past presentations that we've mostly given them to audiences where we felt, you have to convince somebody that the UFOs really exist and the alien abduction thing is
actually happening.
Whereas with you folks, I don't feel that we're at that place. I think we've gone beyond that, and I don't think we need to convince you that aliens are visiting Earth and that people are being abducted and having, a range of experiences from good to terrible. And so the issue for us now becomes how to turn these sometimes terrible, difficult experiences to live with, because people have families, and it's not just affecting us as adults, but children too, and that's a really difficult thing to deal with. So I think it's important that that for you people out there that are having these kinds of problems and trying to deal with this on a daily basis, there are ways to make it less painful
And turn it into something positive.
Yeah, turn it into something positive and not as frightening. And so it works for us, and maybe it could also work for you.
Someone asked me the other day how we dealt with this type of experience, if we were terrified all the time. And I expressed to them that you have a choice. It's like an old Lakota Indian saying where a young warrior asked about courage or fear. And the shaman replied to him, "They're like two wolves." And the young man said, "Well, which is the stronger of the two?" And the shaman said, "The one that you feed." And so if you feed yourself toward the positive, it's so much easier to deal with the other.
Can I add something to that,
Sure.
Charlie, please? Another thing that Charlie and I have been very, very lucky to have over the past dozen years or so is a support group. There are people in our lives, some very, very special people, who provide an amazing level of support to not just us, but to many abductees experiencers. A few of them are in the audience tonight. I can't stress enough how important it is to have that kind of support network. If you don't have that kind of support network, here of course you do, you have Starborn. So take advantage of those, and if you don't have one, create them, because it's very important to be able to talk to other people with similar experiences and to know that you can share those in a safe environment. Something where you're not going to feel ridiculed, somewhere where you're not going to feel threatened, somewhere where you can share your experiences and the pieces of the puzzle. You know, we've talked to many, many people. I'm sure Travis has too, and many others in the audience, where sometimes they say the craziest things, but then all of a sudden a little piece of that puzzle comes out, and it fits. And that's really, it's really important to put the puzzle together so we can get the big picture. That's what we're all looking for.
We put this up to thank Jack, Jim's brother, who's unable to attend anymore because of severe health issues, David Jacobs, and Ramsey Coulier, who is one of the most wonderful people, our friends John Mack, Bud Hopkins, who have passed away and we've lost recently. Also now among those are
Michael
O'Connell, and we had Jesse Marcel Jr. I gave a presentation with him a number of years ago in South Carolina. Betty Hill, John Carpenter, and so many, many more. Oh, speaking of Carpenter, many of you may not know that he was, or not Carpenter, Gordon Cooper, I'm sorry. Gordon Cooper was one of our Mercury 7 astronauts, and I just happened to have one of the latest Air Force identification charts that Stan would probably agree. That is swamp gas. All right, well, thank you all very much.
Thank you all very much. I hear the hum. The hum is there. I don't know if any of you get the hum, but I get it all the time. And then I also have a feeling that there's a very malevolent presence in my house or in my room, even though I never see anything. That happens on occasion, not every night, but every other month or so. So those kind of things are still happening. The repressed memories are still coming out as nightmares, a lot of nightmares.
Yeah, please step up.
I'm
if
just
you
now
have
being
any
treated
questions.
for severe sleep deprivation at one of the local hospitals, so it's ongoing, but no abductions in the past couple of years that I remember anywhere that I want to explore. You're welcome.
You just had a book reference. I wanted to check. One of the books was up there written by a man by the name of Juan Chuck Bong.
Yeah, one Chuck
B-O-N-G.
Bong, The God's Machine.
A God's Machine.
Yes,
Thank you.
very good book.
Just had a quick question. I wanted to say thank you for sharing your artwork with us.
You're very welcome.
I'm somewhat of an artist myself, and that really validated me seeing, because I know how observant you are as artists. That really blew me away, your artwork. Really, I would like to know that if you guys ever have anything like that available for purchase, I would love to. The paintings, the pottery, I just was totally.
Jack has a website. It's called UFO Twins. Jack has a website that we just created for him to sell some of his artwork from. I think it's UFO-Allagash-Twins.com, so you can go there, and he's made a bunch of like screen, what do they call them?
Screensavers.
Not screensavers, but wallpapers that you can purchase very cheaply, and it will help Jack out immensely with his medical expenses.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
Questions?
I thank you so much for such an excellent presentation. I'm speechless.
Gosh.
Really, I am. Rarely do you get someone who has an experience who's such an incredible artist. So the visual component is huge. Just a simple question. When you were returned and you were scrambling out to the beach where your campsite was, did you notice, this is kind of silly, but were you in the same order in the canoe that you were taken in?
I honestly don't remember.
Can't even remember, right?
We were.
I remember Chuck was still sitting in the back of the canoe, and
Had
the
he
three of
started
us.
out in the back of the canoe?
No, he was just still sitting in the canoe.
No, but yes, if
When you
started
saw the
out,
light.
passed
Oh,
out.
yes.
He
I'm
had
sorry.
been in the back.
He had been in the back at the beginning, and I was in the front. Paddling.
Paddling.
Other questions?
All right.